The bride did not run. When the laughter cracked open across the chapel like a dropped plate, and her own mother turned her face away, and the groom set down the ring on the pew like a man setting down a thing that had gone bad in his pocket, Mabel Rourke did not run. She stood there in the white dress that had been let out twice and stitched a third time by lamplight, and she lifted her chin the way a person lifts a lantern in a dark room, and she looked every single one of them in the eye until the laughter ran out of breath. She was 26 years old, 311 pounds at her own count, the only daughter of a dead wheat farmer and a mother who had spent her life apologizing for her child's body, and nobody in Crook County, Wyoming had ever expired politely. But she did not disappear. She walked the length of that aisle alone, past the snickers and the pitying eyes and the second cousin who was already whispering the story she would tell at supper, and she opened the chapel door, and she walked out into the white June sun, with her veil still pinned to her hair, and not a single tear fell from her eyes until she was a half-mile down the wagon road and out of sight of every soul who had wanted to see her break. If that moment did something to you, if it landed somewhere under your ribs the way it landed under hers, then stay with me through this one all the way to the end, because what happens to Mabel Rourke in the months that follow is the kind of story that doesn't get told often enough, and it deserves to be heard from the first humiliation to the last vindication. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mabel's story to its finish, and while you're down there in the comments, drop the name of the town you're listening from, because I want to see how far this story travels across the country and across the years. Now, let me take you back to where it really began. 3 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon in late May, when Mabel Rourke first heard the name of the man who would, without ever meaning to, change the entire shape of her life. The letter had come on a Tuesday, and it had come because Mabel's mother had answered an advertisement. Mabel had never been shown. Eliza Rourke was a small woman with small worries and a small, frightened conviction that her daughter's size was a personal failure of her own mothering, and after the funeral of Mabel's father and the slow swallowing of their 160 acres by the bank, Eliza had begun writing letters to anyone who would have her grown unmarried daughter taken off her hands. The letter that came back was written in a careful slanted hand on the stationery of one Harlan Pace of Pace and Pace Stockman of Buffalo, Wyoming, and it said that Mr. Pace's nephew, a young man of good prospects named Cyrus Pace, was in want of a sensible wife and was not particular as to looks. Mabel read those last 4 words twice. Not particular as to looks. She folded the letter very carefully along its existing creases and set it on the kitchen table between the sugar tin and the chipped blue pitcher, and she did not say anything to her mother for a long minute. Her mother stood at the stove with her back turned and her shoulders held too high, and Mabel understood, in the way grown daughters come to understand their mothers, that the silence was a request. So she said, "Yes," she said, "yes," because there was no money left and the house was being sold in September, and her mother had a sister in Omaha who would take Eliza, but not Mabel, and she said yes because at 26 in Crook County, a woman who had not married was a woman who would not. Most secret room of her own heart, she still believed, against all the evidence of her life, that a person might be loved without being apologized for first. She made herself a promise that night, sitting on the edge of the iron bed in the room that had been hers since she was 4. She promised herself that she would never again let herself believe a stranger's kindness was meant for her until that stranger had proved it 3 times over, and she promised herself that whatever happened in Buffalo, whatever this Cyrus Pace turned out to be, she would not cry in front of anyone ever again. She kept the first promise longer than she expected. She broke the second one inside 3 weeks. The wedding was set for June the 17th at the small Methodist chapel on the edge of Buffalo, and Mabel rode the train west with 2 carpet bags and her father's pocket watch wrapped in a handkerchief in her skirt pocket. The watch was the only thing of his she had managed to keep when the bankmen came through the house with their lists, and she touched it now without thinking, the way other people touched a cross or a coin, every time the world tilted under her. She touched it when the porter looked her up and down and silently moved her to a wider seat. She touched it when a woman across the aisle leaned over to her companion and said something behind a gloved hand. She touched it when the train pulled into Buffalo, and she saw, standing on the platform in a pearl gray suit and a hat too fine for the dust, the man who must be Cyrus Pace, and she watched his face go from polite expectation to a small, controlled flinch. The moment his eyes found her, he recovered quickly. He was a man trained. She would learn to recover quickly from things that disappointed him. He took her bags and he made conversation about the weather, and he handed her up into a buggy with the cautious courtesy of a man handling a piece of furniture he had not ordered, and he drove her out to his Uncle Harlan's house on the north end of town, without once looking at her sideways. The house was large and white and full of women who had been told to be kind. His aunt was kind. His cousin was kind. The hired girl was kind. The kindness was a soft, thick blanket laid over a hard thing, and Mabel felt the hard thing under it every time a hand patted her arm. The wedding was in 9 days. In those 9 days she was fitted for a dress, walked through the chapel, instructed in the names of Pace cousins and Pace associates and Pace cattle brands, and shown to a small upstairs room with a window that looked east over the plains. She was not unkindly treated. She was simply, constantly, gently being prepared, the way a thing is prepared. On the 7th day the dress was finished, and she put it on in front of the long mirror in his aunt's sewing room, and his aunt stood behind her with her hands folded under her bosom, and said, in the voice of a woman delivering a verdict she had long rehearsed, that Mabel looked very nice, considering. Mabel said thank you. She counted the buttons down the back of the dress in the mirror. There were 22. She counted them again. There were still 22. On the morning of the wedding, her mother did not come. The letter from Omaha said the train fare was beyond her at present, and that she sent her love and her prayers, and that she knew Mabel would be a credit to herself. Mabel folded that letter along its creases too, and put it in her carpetbag under her stockings. And she did not let herself sit down on the bed and read it again, because if she sat down, she was not certain she would stand back up. The chapel was full. That was the thing she had not expected. She had thought, in the small mercy of her imagination, that a stranger's wedding in a strange town might be sparsely attended. But Cyrus Pace was a man of standing in Buffalo, and his uncle was a man of greater standing, and half of Johnson County had come to see what kind of woman the younger Pace had sent away. They filled the pews in their summer suits and their feathered hats, and they turned as one when the chapel doors opened, and Mabel felt the turning the way a person feels a sudden cold wind. She walked the aisle alone because there was no one to give her away. She had asked the minister to omit that part of the ceremony, and he had agreed with the slow blink of a man who understood why. She reached the altar, and she stood beside Cyrus Pace in his fine new coat. And the minister began to read, and somewhere around the part about the joining of two souls, Cyrus Pace turned to her and said, in a voice not quite low enough that he was sorry, but he could not do this. The minister stopped reading. The chapel went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something private has just become public. Cyrus did not look at her. He looked at his uncle in the front pew, and his uncle's face did a slow, dark thing that was not surprise. He had known. They had all known. The whole 9 days of kindness had been the soft, thick blanket laid over the hard fact that Cyrus Pace had been working up the nerve or the cruelty to do exactly this. He set the ring on the pew. He said, still not looking at her, that she was a fine woman and would no doubt find a suitable match elsewhere, and that the Paces would, of course, cover her train fare home. And then somebody in the back of the chapel laughed. It was not a cruel laugh exactly. It was the laugh of a person too embarrassed to know what else to do, the laugh that escapes a tight throat when a thing has gone wrong in public and there is no script for it. But once it was out, it gave permission. A second laugh joined it, then a third, sharper, from a woman in a green hat who had been waiting all morning for something to tell at supper. Mabel's mother was not there, but Mabel saw her anyway in the half-turned faces, in the way the women dropped their eyes, the way her mother had been dropping her eyes for 26 years. And that was when Mabel Rourke, who had been preparing all her life to disappear politely, decided that she would not. She lifted her chin, she looked at the woman in the green hat until the woman's laugh dried up in her mouth. She looked at the second cousin, already framing her supper story. She looked at Harlan Pace in the front pew, and Harlan Pace looked away. She looked, last, at Cyrus, who finally found the courage to look back at her, and she said, in a voice that carried farther than she had known her voice could carry, that she hoped he would have the life he deserved. Then she turned, and she walked out. She walked out of the chapel and down the steps, and into the white June sun, and she kept walking in her wedding dress, with her veil still pinned, down the wagon road that led south out of Buffalo. And she did not stop walking until the chapel bell and the murmur of the crowd had been swallowed up entirely by the sound of meadowlarks and the dry shifting of grass. Then, and only then, she sat down on a flat sandstone rock at the edge of a dry wash, and she put her face in her hands and she cried the way a person cries when they have been holding it back for 9 days and 26 years. She cried until she could not breathe. And then she cried more quietly, and then she stopped, because she had told herself she would not do this in front of anyone, and the meadowlarks were watching. She wiped her face on the inside hem of the veil because there was nothing else to wipe it on. She took the pocket watch out of her skirt and she held it in her palm until the metal warmed against her skin. It was past noon. The sun was beginning the long, slow tilt toward afternoon, and she was 8 miles from town in a dress that weighed nearly as much as a small child, and she had no plan and no money beyond the $4 folded in her stocking, and no place in the world that was waiting for her. She heard the wagon before she saw it. It came up the road from the south, slow, a single horse and a flatbed loaded with fencing wire, and a sack of feed and a coil of rope, and the man driving it was a long, lean shape in a dust-colored coat with a low-crowned hat pulled against the sun. He saw her from a quarter-mile out. He did not speed up. He did not slow down. He came on at the same patient pace, and when he reached her, he stopped the horse, and he sat there for a long moment without speaking, looking at the woman in the wedding dress on the rock by the dry wash. And Mabel braced herself for whatever was coming. What came was this. He touched the brim of his hat. He said, "Ma'am," he said, "you headed somewhere, or you sitting?" She almost laughed. It was the first thing anyone had said to her all day that did not have a soft, thick blanket folded into it. She said she did not rightly know. He nodded as though that were a reasonable answer. He said, "My place is 6 miles on. There's a bunk room over the tack barn nobody uses. You're welcome to it for the night if you've nowhere else, and tomorrow we can figure the rest." He said it the way a man might say the weather looked like rain, no flourish, no pity, a flat, practical offer made by a man who had assessed a situation and concluded that a woman in a wedding dress 8 miles from town at noon required first shelter and only later an explanation. She looked at him a long moment. He was, perhaps, 35, weathered around the eyes, clean-shaven, with the kind of stillness in his hands on the reins that she had seen in her father and in very few other men. He did not look at her dress. He did not look at her body. He looked at her face, at the eyes, and he waited. She said, "Why?" He said, "Because you're sitting on my road, and the sun's going to be hard by 3, he said. "No other reason." She climbed up onto the wagon. He did not offer a hand, and she was grateful for it, because a hand would have been a test of whether he could take her weight, and the absence of the hand was a small, unspoken acknowledgment that the test was beneath both of them. She gathered the dress around her on the seat, and she set the carpet bag, which a kind boy from the chapel had run after her with at the edge of the churchyard between her feet. He clucked to the horse and the wagon started up, and for the first mile neither of them said a word. Then he said, "Name's Wade, Calloway," she said. "Mabel Rourke," he said, pleased. And that was all the conversation they had for the next 5 miles. The Calloway place sat in a shallow basin where 2 creeks came together, and the house was small and square and built of weathered plank, with a tin roof gone soft red with rust, and a covered porch that ran the length of the front. Behind it stood a tack barn, a horse barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, with the wire sagging, and a long, low building Mabel would later learn was the lambing shed. The fences were standing but tired. The yard was swept, but the broom marks were old. It was a place, she thought, that was being held together by one pair of hands, and just barely a dog came out from under the porch as the wagon rolled in. It was a brindle thing, knee-high, with one notched ear and a long scar down its flank, and it stopped 20 feet from the wagon and stood with its head low and its weight on its back legs, watching her. Wade said, "That's June," he said. "She don't take to strangers." He said it almost as an apology, not to Mabel but to the dog, as though warning the dog that a stranger was being unavoidably introduced. He helped her down from the wagon by setting his hand near her elbow without quite touching it, a courtesy that let her step down under her own power, and he carried her carpet bag to the foot of the tack barn ladder and set it there. He climbed up first to be sure the bunk room was fit, and she heard him moving above her, opening a window, beating dust out of a blanket. He came down and said it would do for tonight. He said the privy was behind the smokehouse and the pump was by the kitchen door, and that supper was at 6, and she was welcome at the table, or he could bring a plate up. Whichever suited, she said she would come to the table. He nodded, touched his hat, and walked off toward the horse barn. The brindle dog stayed where she was watching, and when Mabel moved toward the ladder, the dog moved too, 3 slow steps sideways to keep the same distance. Mabel stopped. She crouched as much as the dress would allow, and she held out one hand, palm down, and she did not speak. She counted in her head, 1, 2, 3, 4. The dog did not move. Mabel stayed crouched until her knees ached, and then she straightened slowly and climbed the ladder, and the dog watched her all the way up. The bunk room over the tack barn was small and clean, and smelled of oiled leather and old hay and the faint cold tin of last winter's stove. There was a narrow iron bed with a striped wool blanket. There was a wash basin on a 3-legged stand. There was a single window facing east, and through it she could see the 2 creeks coming together in a slow brown braid in the grass. She sat down on the bed. The bed creaked and held. She did not cry again. She undid the 22 buttons down the back of the wedding dress, one by one, counting them out loud in the empty room, and she folded the dress over the foot of the bed, and she put on the gray cotton dress from the carpet bag, and she went down to supper. Supper was beans and cornbread and a slab of ham and black coffee, and it was served on a scrubbed pine table by Wade Calloway himself, who set down 2 plates and 2 cups and a tin of butter and sat across from her without ceremony. He bowed his head briefly. He did not say a grace out loud. He picked up his fork. He said, "Eat." She ate. She had not eaten since the night before, having been too sick with nerves at breakfast, and the food was plain and hot, and exactly what her body wanted, and she ate it slowly because she had learned long ago not to eat fast in front of anyone. He did not watch her eat. He looked at his own plate and now and again out the window at the failing light, and when he had finished he poured them both more coffee. He said, "You don't owe me your story," he said, "but if you want to tell me how I came to find you on that rock, I'll listen." She thought about it. She drank her coffee. She said, "I was supposed to be married this morning," she said. The gentleman changed his mind at the altar. She said it flat, without ornament. The way she had learned that morning was the only way to say a thing like that without breaking. Wade Calloway did not move for a moment. Then he said, "That's a coward's way." He said it quietly. He said, "I'm sorry." He did not ask the man's name. He did not ask why. He did not ask whether she had loved the man, which she had not, or whether she had any place to go, which she did not. He drank his coffee, and after a while he said, "I run sheep here, mostly," he said. "Some cattle," he said. "The place was my father's, and his before him." He said, "I lost my wife 5 years back to the fever, and my boy with her, and I've run it alone since, and the hired help comes and goes." He said it the way he had said everything else, level and without invitation to pity, and Mabel understood that he was giving her an exchange. "A fact for a fact, a wound for a wound," she said. "I'm Ari," he said, "long time back." He said, "Doesn't ache the way it did." He stood and gathered the plates, and when she rose to help, he said, "Sit. You've had a day," and she sat back down because she did not have the strength to argue and because nobody had said sit. You had a day to her in so long that the words themselves felt like a small warm thing she did not want to put down. He washed the plates in the basin by the window and dried them on a flour sack towel and stacked them on the shelf. And when he was done, he stood with his back to her for a moment, looking out at the dusk. And then he turned and said, "In the morning I'll drive you to wherever you mean to go. Or," he said, "if you've nowhere yet to mean to go, the bunkroom holds till you do." He said it the same way he had offered the ride. No flourish, no condition, a flat, practical statement of available shelter. She said, "I'll think on it overnight." He nodded, said good night, and went out the kitchen door toward the barn to see to the horse for the evening. And Mabel sat alone at the scrub pine table in the failing light and listened to the sounds of a strange house settling around her. And she understood, with a small, clean shock, that this was the first kindness she had been offered in 9 days that did not have a hard thing folded inside it. She climbed the ladder to the bunkroom in the last of the dusk. The brindle dog was lying at the foot of the ladder when she went up, and the brindle dog was still lying there when she looked down from the window above, and Mabel took this as neither welcome nor warning but simply as information. She lay down on the narrow iron bed in the gray cotton dress, because she did not trust her own arms not to shake if she tried to undress again, and she pulled the striped wool blanket up to her chin, and she lay in the dark listening to the 2 creeks braiding together in the grass below the window, and she did not sleep for a long while. And when she finally did sleep, she dreamed of nothing at all, which was a mercy. She woke before the sun. That was a habit from the farm, set in her bones since she was 8, and it did not leave her now even in a strange bed in a strange country. The window was a square of cold gray light. She lay still for a minute listening, and she heard the sound of a man moving in the yard below, the creak of the pump handle, the scuff of a boot on a board, the low murmur of a voice speaking to a horse. She got up. She washed her face in the basin. She put up her hair. She went down. Wade Calloway was at the pump filling a bucket. He looked up when she came around the corner of the tack barn, and he touched his hat without quite breaking the rhythm of the pumping, and he said, "Coffee's on the stove." She went into the kitchen and poured herself a cup, and stood drinking it in the open doorway, watching him work. He carried the bucket to the horse trough and ticked it in. He came back, pumped a second bucket, carried it to the chicken coop, and set it down for the hens, who came out cautiously in 1s and 2s, like elderly women uncertain of the weather. He fixed the sagging wire on the coop door with 3 quick turns of a length of baling twine he pulled from his coat pocket. He moved without hurry, but without any wasted motion either, the way a man moves who has done the same things, in the same order, every morning for a great many years. She watched him a long while. She set her empty cup on the porch rail, and she walked down into the yard, and when he saw her coming he straightened from the coop and waited. She said, "I can mend that wire proper for you," she said. "I've done coop since I was 9. He looked at her. He looked at the coop. He said, "You've handled poultry," she said. "300 layers at the height of it, before the bank took the place." She said, I can tell you which of yours is off her feed and which is broody, and which is the boss hen, without watching them more than a quarter hour." She said it not to boast, but because it was true, and because she had decided sometime between the dark of the night and the gray of the morning that if this man was going to give her a roof for another night, she was going to give him a day's worth of work in exchange, and that the work was going to be the kind of work she actually knew how to do. Wade Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "The wire's in the lean-to behind the smokehouse," he said. "Pliers on the nail above the door," he said. "Much obliged." And he went back to the horse barn, and Mabel Rourke, in her gray cotton dress, and her hair in a plain knot and a borrowed leather apron she found on a hook by the kitchen door, spent the first morning of the rest of her life mending the chicken coop of a man she had known for less than a day. She mended it properly. She cut new wire to length, and she twisted the joins tight against the posts, and she rehung the door so it swung true and latched, and when she was done, she stood inside the coop, with the hens stepping around her ankles, and she found in under 10 minutes the one with the swollen foot and the one going light, and the old Buff Orpington, who was running the place like a county magistrate, and she made a small mental ledger of each of them. Then she came out and she walked the fence line of the yard, and she made another mental ledger of every place a fox could get through, and there were 4 of them. She did not say any of this to Wade Calloway when he came in at noon. She set out the bread and the cold ham and the pickle jar that she had found in the cold cellar, and she poured the coffee, and when he sat down, she sat down across from him, and she said, "The Buff Orpington's the one running things, but she's near the end of her laying. The young barred rock with the yellow legs will take over by fall if you let her. The little brown one in the corner has a swollen foot from a splinter, and I drew it and packed it with lard. She'll do. And there are 4 places a fox could come through your yard fence, 3 on the north side and 1 by the smokehouse." He set down his fork. He looked at her. He said, "In one morning," she said, "in one morning." He said, "Ma'am, I have had 3 hired hands in 5 years, and not one of them could have told me which hen was the boss hen." He said it without smiling, but something at the corner of his eyes moved that might have been a smile in another man's face. He said, "The bunkroom holds as long as you want it," he said. "I can pay you $8 the month and your board, which is what I paid the last hand, and it isn't much, but it's honest." He said, "You think on it." She did not think on it long. She said, "I'll take it." He nodded once. He picked up his fork. He said, "Then we'd best see about those foxholes before dark." And that was how Mabel Rourke became, on the 2nd day after her wedding, that was not a wedding, the hired hand at the Calloway place 6 miles south of Buffalo, Wyoming, in the early summer of a year she would later remember as the one in which her life finally turned around to face her. The first week she fixed the 4 foxholes and the chicken coop, and the wire on the kitchen garden, and the latch on the smokehouse door, and she scrubbed the kitchen floor on her hands and knees one evening, not because Wade had asked her to, but because she could not stand to look at it any longer. And she found in the back of the cold cellar a crock of butter going off, and a sack of cornmeal with weevils in it, and she dealt with both, and she did not once mention the wedding dress folded on the foot of the bunkroom bed. The 2nd week she met the sheep. Wade had 240 head, give or take the lambs, and they ran on the open grass east of the creeks with an old herder named Thomas, who slept in a wagon out there and came in to the home place every 10 days for flour and coffee and tobacco. Thomas was 60 some years old and bent like a question mark, with skin the color of saddle leather and eyes pale as washed denim. And when Wade introduced him to Mabel as the new hand, Thomas looked her up and down once slow and said only, "You handle stock." Mabel said, "Sheep no, poultry and dairy, yes, pigs some." Thomas grunted. He said, "Sheep is patience," he said. "You got patience, you got sheep," he said. "You ain't got patience, sheep eat your life." Then he took his flour and his coffee and his tobacco, And he went back out to the wagon, and Wade told Mabel later that night that this had been the longest speech Tomas had made to a new hand in 11 years, and that he counted it a good sign. The third week she met the rest of them. There was a boy named Eli who came over from the next place 3 days and 7 to help with whatever needed, 2 pairs of hands. He was 14, all elbows and Adam's apple with a cowlick that no amount of water would lay down, and he had been working since he was 9 to help his widowed mother keep their 40 acres. And he had decided within about 10 minutes of meeting Mabel that she was the most interesting person he had ever encountered. On the grounds that she could name every hen by sight, could splint a lamb's leg with 2 willow shoots and a strip of flour sack, and did not, as he put it solemnly to Wade one evening, talk down to a fellow on account of his age. There was a woman named Sarah Tilden who ran the post and dry goods in the little crossroads 4 miles south, a sharp-eyed widow of 40, with 2 grown sons gone to the railroads. And Mabel met her on the first trip in for supplies, and was met in turn with the cool, measuring stare of a woman who had heard the buffalo story already and was reserving judgment. Sarah Tilden said, "You're the one," Mabel said. "I am." Sarah Tilden said nothing else that day, only counted out the change exact and slid it across the counter. But on the second trip in, she gave Mabel a small twist of paper containing peppermints and said only, "For the road." And on the third trip, she said, "You tell Wade Calloway his credit's good through harvest." And Mabel understood that something had been decided in her favor that she had not known was being weighed. And there was, of course, Harlan Pace. Harlan Pace did not come to the Calloway place in the first 3 weeks. Harlan Pace did not need to come. Harlan Pace was the kind of man who let news travel to him and then arranged the world from a chair on a wide front porch in town, and the news that the woman his nephew had thrown over at the altar was now working as a hired hand for Wade Calloway 6 miles south reached him. Mabel would later piece together, sometime around the end of her second week. The first sign of it was small. A man Wade had been negotiating with for the purchase of 20 ewes in the fall sent a note to say he had decided to sell the lot elsewhere with no reason given. Wade read the note at the breakfast table and folded it, and put it in his shirt pocket, and said nothing, but Mabel saw the small tightening at the corner of his jaw. The second sign came a week after that. A length of the south boundary fence, where Wade's grass met what had once been open range and was now, by recent purchase, the south edge of the Pace holdings, was found cut clean through in 3 places on a Tuesday morning, and 12 of Wade's ewes were found mixed in with Pace cattle. Wade rode over alone to fetch them back. He came back at dusk with the 12 ewes and a face that had gone very still, and when Mabel asked him at supper what had been said, he said only, "Harlan Pace was courteous." He said the word courteous the way another man might have said the word rotten. He said he offered to buy the whole flock at $3 the head, which is half what they're worth. On account of, he said, the difficulty of running sheep next to cattle in this country, he said Harlan Pace had smiled the whole time, and that the smile had not reached his eyes, and that he, Wade, had thanked him and declined and ridden home. He said all of this in about 6 sentences across the whole of supper, and Mabel, who was learning to read him, understood that 6 sentences from Wade Calloway on a single subject was the equivalent of another man pounding the table. She said, "The fence was cut clean," he said. "Clean?" she said. "Sheep don't cut fence?" He said, "No, they do not." They looked at each other across the scrubbed pine table in the lamplight, and a thing passed between them that did not need to be spoken aloud, which was the shared understanding that Harlan Pace had begun something, and that whatever it was he had begun was not going to stop with 12 ewes and a length of cut wire. The third sign came on a Sunday. Mabel had been at the Calloway place 31 days by her own count, kept in pencil on the inside of the bunkroom door, when she walked down to the kitchen in the cool of an early morning and found the folded piece of cream-colored paper that had been slid under the front door of the house. It was addressed to her by name, in the careful slanted hand she remembered from the first letter and it was from Harlan Pace himself. The letter was a marvel of indirection. It said that Mr. Maestre Pace had been distressed to learn of her continued presence in the county, and had felt it his Christian duty to write. It said that he understood she had taken employment with Mr. Calloway, and that while, no doubt, Mr. Calloway was a gentleman of decent intentions, the appearance of an unmarried woman residing on a bachelor's holding was, he was sorry to say, beginning to draw a certain kind of comment in town. It said that Mr. Pace, in light of the distress his nephew had caused, and out of nothing but concern for her good name, was prepared to offer her the sum of $100, payable at once, and a train ticket to any city east of the Missouri she chose to name, on the single condition that she depart Crook County within the week and not return. It was signed, with his compliments, Harlan Pace. Mabel read the letter twice. She did not feel what she might once have felt, which was shame. She felt instead a cold, clean anger that started somewhere behind her breastbone and moved outward into her hands, and she folded the letter along its existing creases the way she folded all letters, and she walked out the kitchen door and across the yard to where Wade was harnessing the horse for the ride to the chapel at the crossroads, which they did on Sundays, not because Wade was a religious man, but because it was, he had told her once, a way of being counted present in the community without having to say much. She held out the letter. She said, "Read it." He read it. He read it twice the way she had. He did not change expression. He folded it and handed it back to her, and he said, "You mean to take it," she said. "I do not." He nodded once, and the nod was a small thing, but it sat in her chest the rest of the morning like a coal she could warm her hands at. He said, "Then we say nothing yet," he said. "We keep it." He said, "A man who writes such a thing in his own hand has handed you a piece of rope, and the proper thing is to coil it and put it by until you need it," she said. "You mean to use it," he said. "I mean to keep it where it can be used," he said. "In the meantime, we don't speak of it, and we don't change a thing about how we go on." She put the letter in the bottom of her carpet-bag under her stockings, beside the letter from her mother in Omaha she had not yet answered, and she did not speak of it again that day. But in the chapel at the crossroads that morning she sat on the women's side, and she felt the eyes of 3 different women slide across her in a way they had not slid the week before. And she understood that Harlan Pace had not only written to her, he had begun to speak. The 4th week, and the 5th week, and the 6th week of Mabel Rourke's life at the Calloway place passed in the long, slow rhythm of a working summer, and in that rhythm she found, almost without noticing, that she had begun to be happy. It was not happiness of the kind books described. It was a smaller, sturdier thing, made of small, repeated facts. The fact that the chickens came running to her, now when she crossed the yard. The fact that the brindle dog June, who had kept her 3-step distance for 11 days, had on the 12th day walked up to her at the pump, and laid her notched head once against Mabel's knee, and then walked off again as though nothing had happened, and after that had taken to lying across the threshold of the kitchen door when Mabel was inside, as though she had appointed herself something. The fact that Eli, the boy from next door, had begun to ask her, with elaborate casualness, how she had learned this thing and that thing, and that she had begun to teach him, without making a lesson of it. The fact that Thomas, the old herder, on his 10-day visit in early July, had brought in with his usual flour and coffee and tobacco a small carved wooden whistle on a leather thong, and had set it on the kitchen table in front of her, without comment. And when she had asked what it was, he had said only, "For the dog, you'll want her to come when you call her," and had gone back out to his wagon. The fact that Sarah Tilden at the dry goods now greeted her by name and asked after the lambs. The fact that Wade Calloway, who had begun the 1st week by speaking perhaps 30 words to her in a day, had by the 6th week begun to sit on the porch in the evenings after supper with a 2nd cup of coffee in his hand, and to say in his level, quiet way, the small, ordinary things a man says about his day to a person whose presence he has come to count on. He never said anything large. He said the south pasture was holding water better than he had hoped after the June rains. He said the bay mare was favoring her off hind a touch, and he meant to look at it in the morning. He said Tomas had reported a cougar sign up by the high meadow, and that they would need to watch the lambs close for a stretch. He said these things the way another man might have said, "I am glad you are here," and Mabel, sitting in the other porch chair with her own coffee cooling in her hands, heard them the way they were meant. She did not tell him about the days she had begun to dread the idea of leaving. She did not tell him about the moment in the second week when she had taken the wedding dress down from the foot of the bunkroom bed, folded it into the smallest square it would make, and put it at the very bottom of the carpet bag, under the letters, as a thing she meant to keep but not to see. She did not tell him that she had not touched her father's pocket watch in 11 days, which was the longest she had gone without touching it since the day the bankmen came. She did not tell him because the not telling was itself a kind of telling, and because she had learned by the 6th week that Wade Calloway understood best the things that were not said. The letter from Harlan Pace stayed in the bottom of the carpet bag. The cut fence stayed mended. The 12 ewes stayed home. And in the long golden evenings of that first summer, with the meadowlarks going quiet one by one in the grass, and the two creeks braiding together in the slow brown dusk below the bunkroom window, Mabel Rourke began, against the explicit promise she had made herself on the iron bed in Crook County. The trouble started in earnest on a Thursday in the second week of July. Eli came up the wagon road at a dead run, his cowlick standing straight up and his face the color of a poppy, and he came around the side of the house calling for Wade before he had even slowed down. Wade came out of the horse barn with the currycomb in his hand, and Mabel came out of the kitchen with flour to her wrists, and the boy bent over with his hands on his knees and got out between gulps of air that there were men on the north fence with wire cutters, 3 of them, and that they had not seen him because he had come up through the willows. Wade did not run. Wade went very still for the space of 1 breath, and then he set the currycomb on the porch rail, and he went into the house and came out with his rifle and a box of cartridges, and he said to Mabel, "You stay." He said to Eli, "You ride for Sarah Tilden, and you tell her to send for the sheriff, and you do not stop for any man on the road." Eli was back on his pony and gone before Wade had finished saying it. Wade swung up onto the bay mare bareback because there was no time for a saddle, and he was gone too, north, at a long, even canter that ate the ground without spending the horse. Mabel stood in the yard with flour to her wrists and watched him out of sight. And then she went back into the kitchen, and she washed her hands, and she took down from the high shelf above the stove the small heavy revolver Wade had shown her on the 3rd week, where it was kept and how it worked, and she put it in the deep pocket of her apron. And she went out, and she sat on the porch step with the brindle dog June at her feet, and she counted. She counted the chickens crossing the yard. There were 19 visible, and 3 more she could account for by the sound of clucking from inside the coop. She counted the fence posts along the kitchen garden. There were 22. She counted the buttons down the front of her gray cotton dress. There were 9. She counted when she ran out of countable things the seconds between one breath and the next, and she made each breath slower than the last, the way her father had taught her to do the year she was 11, and the prairie fire had come within a mile of their house. Wade came back at dusk. He came down the wagon road at the same long, even canter, alone with the rifle across his thighs and his hat pulled low, and behind him on a lead rope walked a tall sorrel gelding she had never seen before, with an expensive tooled saddle and an empty scabbard and reins knotted up short. He rode into the yard and he swung down and he said, "One of them is on his way to the doctor in Buffalo with a load of buckshot in his backside, and the other 2 are on their way to the sheriff in the back of Sarah Tilden's wagon. And this horse is the one the first man rode out on, and it has Harlan Pace's brand burned into the off-shoulder plane as a printed name." He said all of this in a single breath, and then he stopped and he looked at her on the porch step with the revolver bulge in the apron pocket, and the corner of his mouth did the small thing that in another man would have been a smile. He said, "You held the place," she said. "I counted chickens," he said. "That'll do." He stabled the sorrel in the empty box stall at the back of the horse barn, and he hung a feed bag on its nose, and he came back and he sat down on the porch step beside her, not close, but on the same step, and he set the rifle across his knees, and he looked out across the yard at the last light going pink along the ridge to the west. He said, "The sheriff will come out tomorrow likely, to take a statement," he said. "You'll want to give him the letter," she said. "I will," he said. "After he has the letter, Harlan Pace will come." He said it not as a warning, but as a weather report, the way he had once said the south pasture was holding water. She said, "Let him come." He looked at her, then full, the way he had not quite looked at her before, and he said, "You are a hard woman to scare, Mabel Rourke." She said, "I was scared this morning." She said, "I am scared now." She said, "I am only out of practice running from it." He nodded once slow, and he looked back at the ridge. And after a long minute he said, "My wife was like that." He said, "She would go pale around the mouth, and her hands would shake, and she would do the thing anyway." He said it without grief on it, the way a man recites a fact he has lived with long enough to set down beside himself, and Mabel understood that she had just been given something. She did not reach for it. She did not say anything in return. She only sat with him on the porch step in the pink light with the brindle dog June lying across both their feet, and she let the thing sit between them where he had put it. The sheriff came at 10 the next morning. He was a thick-shouldered man of 50 named Bart Henley, with a graying mustache and an air of having long ago stopped being surprised by anything, and he sat at the scrub pine table with a cup of coffee, and he took out a small leather notebook and a pencil, and he wrote down everything Wade told him in a square, slow hand. He wrote down the cutting of the fence in June. He wrote down the 12 ewes mixed in with Pace cattle. He wrote down the offer of $3 the head. He wrote down the 3 men with wire cutters on the north fence, and the load of buckshot in the first man's backside, and the brand on the off shoulder of the sorrel in the box stall, which he went out and looked at with his own eyes, and came back and wrote down a second time to be sure. Then Mabel went up to the bunk room and brought down the carpet bag, and she took out from the bottom of it, from under the stockings and the folded wedding dress, and the letter from her mother in Omaha, the cream-colored letter from Harlan Part Henley, and she said, "This came under the door on the first Sunday of July." The sheriff read it. He read it twice, the way she had, and the way Wade had. He set it down. He looked at Mabel for a long moment, and then he looked at Wade, and then he looked back at the letter, and he said, "Man, with your permission, I will keep this," he said. "I will keep it in a locked drawer in my office, and I will not produce it unless and until it becomes necessary. And if it becomes necessary, I will produce it in front of a judge," he said. "Do I have your permission?" She said, "You do?" He folded the letter into the inside pocket of his coat, and he buttoned the coat over it, and he stood up, and he said, "Mr. Calloway, Miss Rourke, I'll bid you good day," he said. "You might want to keep that rifle handy a stretch." He touched his hat, and he went out, and they heard his horse going back down the wagon road for a long time, before the sound was finally lost in the wind and the grass. Harlan Pace did not come the next day. He did not come the day after that. He did not come for 9 days, and in those 9 days, Mabel discovered something about herself she had not known, which was that waiting for a thing to happen was, for her, harder than the thing itself. She did her work. She mended the wire on the kitchen garden a second time where a rabbit had got through. She helped Wade and Thomas bring the flock down off the high meadow on account of the cougar sign, and she learned in 2 long days in the saddle of a placid brown mare named Pearl that sheep were in fact patience, and that she had more of it than she had given herself credit for. She walked the fence line of the home place every morning before breakfast and every evening after supper, alone except for the brindle dog June at her heel, and she found nothing cut and nothing wrong, and she came back into the kitchen each time with a small, unsteady relief that she did not name out loud. On the evening of the 9th day, Harlan Pace came. He came in a black buggy with red wheels, drawn by a matched pair of bay horses, and he was driven by a thin young man in a black coat, who Mabel understood, without being told, was a clerk of some kind. Harlan Pace himself sat in the buggy seat in a fawn-colored suit and a low-crowned hat, the same fawn color, and he had a gold watch chain across his vest, and a small smile already on his face when the buggy came into the yard, as though he had been practicing the smile the whole 6 miles out from Buffalo. He did not get down at first. He sat in the buggy and he touched the brim of his hat to Mabel, who had come out onto the porch at the sound of the wheels, and he said, "Good evening to you, Miss Rourke." He said it in a voice as smooth as the inside of a glove. He said, "I had hoped to speak with Mr. Calloway." Wade came around the corner of the horse barn at that moment with the rifle in the crook of his arm, the way a man carries a rifle when he wants it to be seen without being pointed, and he stopped at the foot of the porch steps, and he said, "Mr. Pace." He did not say good evening. Harlan Pace's smile did not change. He climbed down from the buggy with the small, careful motions of a man who was no longer young, and he stood in the dust of the yard with his fawn hat in his hands, and he said, "Mr. Calloway, I have come to settle a misunderstanding." He said, "There has been, I am sorry to say, some unpleasantness between our 2 properties, and I have come in person and in good faith to put it right." He said, "I am prepared to make full restitution for the fence and for any inconvenience, and I am prepared further to make Miss Rourke a renewed and increased offer, in light of all that has passed, of $200 and her passage to any city she names. With my sincere apologies for the distress my nephew caused her, and my sincere hope that she will accept this as the act of friendship it is meant to be." He said all of this in one long, smooth breath, looking only at Wade and not at Mabel, and when he had finished he settled his hat back on his head, and he waited, and his clerk in the buggy took out a small leather pocketbook and held it in his lap in a way that suggested $200 was in it already. Wade did not move. Wade did not speak for a long count, and Mabel, on the porch behind him, found that she had begun to count the count, and it reached 14 before Wade said, "Mr. Pace, the lady is on the porch behind me, Mr. Pace. Pace, you might address her directly." Harlan Pace's smile flickered for the first time, the smallest tightening at one corner, and he turned his face up to the porch, and he said, "Miss Rourke," he said, "I would value your answer." Mabel came down the porch steps. She came down slow, holding the rail in her gray cotton dress, with her hair in its plain knot, and she stopped at the bottom step beside Wade, and she looked Harlan Pace in the eye, and she said, "Mr. Pace, I am not for sale," she said. "I was not for sale at $100, and I am not for sale at $200, and I will not be for sale at any figure you can name, because I am not a thing to be moved off a piece of land that I have come to be useful on," she said. "You may have your fence money if you owe it, and you may take it up with the sheriff if you do, but you may not buy me out of this county." She said it level and plain, without raising her voice, and when she had finished she stood there with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she waited. Harlan Pace looked at her. The smile was entirely gone now. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse that has refused a jump for the 2nd time, with the calculation of a man deciding whether the horse is worth more sold for parts. And then he made the mistake. He said low, with a sudden ugly edge under the smooth, that it was a pity, a real pity, that a woman of her unfortunate proportions should imagine she had any standing to refuse a generous offer, and that he had thought, in his Christian charity, to spare her the embarrassment of remaining in a country where every soul knew the story of her humiliation. But if she preferred to play at being useful on a failing sheep place owned by a widower who could not afford a proper hand, then he washed his hands of her, and she would find in short order that the country had a way of teaching such lessons on its own. He said it in one ugly rush, and then he stopped, and his face went a slow, careful color as he realized what he had said and where he had said it, because he had not said it only to Mabel and Wade. He had said it loud enough that the thin young clerk in the buggy had heard every word and had gone very still with the leather pocketbook in his lap, and he had said it loud enough that Eli, who had come up the wagon road behind the buggy on his pony with a basket of his mother's eggs for trade, and had stopped at the gate when he saw the buggy, had heard every word, and he had said it loud enough that the brindle dog June, who had come around from the kitchen side, had set up a low, steady growl from somewhere deep in her chest, and he had said it loud enough that the second buggy, which had come quietly up the wagon road behind his own, and had stopped at the gate beside Eli's pony without anyone in the yard noticing, had heard every word too. Bart Henley got down from the second buggy. He got down slow, the way he did everything, and he walked across the yard with his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he stopped about 10 feet from Harlan Pace, and he said, "Evening, Harlan," he said. "I was on my way out to ask you a few questions about a sorrel gelding with your brand on it and a letter signed in your hand, and I thought I might save myself the trip and stop by here first," he said. "You have spared me considerable trouble, Harlan." Pace's face went the color of old paper. He said, "Sheriff, you misunderstand. You have caught me in a moment of frustration." "I did not mean Bart Henley," said Harlan. He said, "I have known you 22 years, and I have heard you talk yourself out of 3 things in that time, and I am going to do you the kindness of not letting you talk yourself out of a 4th in front of this many witnesses." He said, "Eli, son, you ride for the courthouse, and you tell the deputy I want him out here with the wagon." Eli was gone before Bart Henley had finished the sentence, for the second time in 2 weeks, and Mabel thought she had never in her life seen a boy ride a pony quite so well. Harlan Pace did not go quietly, but he did not go loudly either. He went the way such men always go in the end, with a great deal of low, careful talking about lawyers and friends in Cheyenne, and the regrettable nature of misunderstandings, and Bart Henley let him talk, and wrote down what he chose to write down in his square, slow hand. And when the deputy came with the wagon, Harlan Pace climbed up into it without further argument, because he was, in the end, a man who understood when an account had been balanced against him. The thin young clerk drove the black buggy with the red wheels back to Buffalo alone, with the leather pocketbook still in his lap and the $200 still in it, and Mabel watched the buggy out of sight down the wagon road, and she did not feel triumph, and she did not feel pity. She felt only a long, slow settling, the way a room settles when a window that has been rattling in the wind is finally latched. The yard was quiet after they were gone. The brindle dog, June, had stopped growling, and was sitting now at Mabel's heel with her notched ear cocked. The hens had come out of the coop where the commotion had driven them and were stepping cautiously across the dust, looking for the bugs they had been interrupted in pursuing. The sun was beginning the long, pink slide toward the ridge. Wade Calloway lowered the rifle and set the butt of it on the porch step, and he stood there with his hand wrapped around the barrel, and he looked at Mabel for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "You faced him down," she said. "You stood beside me," he said. "I would have stood beside you for considerably worse than that." He said it level, the way he said everything, and she heard it, the way he meant it. They did not say anything else that evening about Harlan Pace. They did the chores in the long pink light. Wade saw to the horses, and Mabel shut up the chickens and counted them in, which there were 22 of the same number as the buttons on the wedding dress folded at the bottom of the carpet bag, which was a coincidence, she noted and did not say aloud. They ate supper together at the scrubbed pine table, beans and cornbread, and the last of the ham, and Wade poured them both a second cup of coffee, and they sat with the coffee cooling between them, and the lamp throwing a soft yellow circle on the table. And at last Wade set his cup down, and he said it was the first time he had said her given name. He had said ma'am, and he had said Miss Rourke, and he had said you, and once, in a long string of instructions, he had said you there, But he had not said Mabel, and the saying of it now sat between them on the table beside the coffee cups, like a small bright thing neither of them was quite ready to pick up. He said, "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I want you to hear me out before you answer, and I want you to know before I ask it that there is no wrong answer, and there is no answer that costs you the bunk room or the work or the $8 the month, and that you can take any amount of time you need to think on it, including the rest of your life." She set her cup down. She folded her hands in her lap. She said, "Ask." He said, "I am 41 years old." He said, "I have been a widower 5 years and some months, and I have not in that time entertained the notion of asking any woman anything because I did not believe there was any woman I would wish to ask." He said, "You came up that road in a wedding dress on the worst day of your life, and I gave you the bunk room because it was the decent thing. And in the 7 weeks since I have watched you mend a coop and read a flock and face down a man twice your age with the courthouse behind him. And I have come to understand, slow because I am slow about such things, that the bunk room is not where you ought to be sleeping." He stopped. He took a breath. He said, "I am not asking you to marry me." He said, "I am not asking you to love me, and I am not asking you to promise me a thing in front of a minister, because you have already had one of those days, and one is enough for any life." He said, "I am asking something simpler. Would you stay?" He said, "Not because you have to, because you want to." He said it, and then he was quiet, and he kept his hands flat on the table on either side of his coffee cup, and he did not look away from her face and Mabel Rourke, who had promised herself on an iron bed in Crook County that she would never believe a stranger's kindness was meant for her until that stranger had proved it 3 times over, sat very still in the lamplight and counted, in the back of her mind, the proofs. There was the wagon on the road in June. There was the bunk room that had been offered for 1 night and held for 50. There was the $8 the month paid in coin on the 1st of July without her having to ask. There was the rifle in the crook of his arm when Harlan Pace had stepped down from the buggy with the smooth glove of his voice. There was the standing beside her on the porch step when she had come down the stairs to say she was not for sale. There was the saying just now of her given name. The proofs were more than 3. The proofs had been more than 3 for weeks. She had only not let herself count them. She did not answer at once. She let the quiet sit, because it was a quiet that could be sat in the way some quiets cannot, and because she had learned in 7 weeks that Wade Calloway did not flinch from a quiet and would not press her to fill one. She picked up her coffee cup. She turned it once in her hands. She said, "I will tell you what I am going to do. I am going to think on it overnight, the way you have given me leave to. I am going to come down to breakfast in the morning, and I am going to tell you my answer then, in the daylight, with the chores ahead of us, because I am a woman who has learned to make decisions about her life in the morning and not at a kitchen table at the end of a long day." He said, "That is fair," he said. "That is more than fair." He stood up and he gathered the cups and he washed them in the basin by the window the way he had done on her first night, and when he was done he stood for a moment with his back to her, looking out into the dark. And then he turned and he said, "Good night, Mabel." She said, "Good night, Wade." He went out to see to the horse for the evening, and she climbed the ladder to the bunk room in the dark because she did not need a lamp to find a place she had climbed to 100 times. And she lay down on the narrow iron bed in her gray cotton dress, and she did not sleep. She lay awake a long time listening to the 2 creeks braiding together in the grass below the window, and at some point in the night she got up, and she lit the small stub of candle on the wash basin stand, and she opened the carpet bag, and she took out the wedding dress from the very bottom, and she shook it out by candlelight in the small bunk room over the tack barn. It was creased and yellowed at the folds. It smelled faintly of cedar from the trunk in the bottom of the carpet bag, and faintly of the dust of the wagon road, 8 miles out of Buffalo, and faintly of something she could not name that was probably only time. She held it up in front of her in the candlelight, and she looked at the 22 buttons down the back of it, and she thought about the woman who had walked down the aisle of the Methodist chapel in it on the 17th of June, and she found with a small, clean surprise that she did not recognize that woman anymore. The woman in the chapel had been holding herself together by the act of not falling. The woman in the bunk room in the candlelight was holding herself together by the act of having stood. They were not the same woman. They had the same hands and the same name and the same father's pocket watch, but they were not the same woman, and the dress she understood belonged to the first woman and not the second. She folded the dress back into its smallest square, and she set it on the foot of the bed, and then she changed her mind and she put it back in the bottom of the carpet bag, because the first woman had been hers too, and you do not throw out a thing only because you have grown past it. She blew out the candle, she lay back down, she slept, after a while, and when she woke the window was a square of cold gray light, and she knew before she opened her eyes what she was going to say. She came down the ladder in the gray light. Wade was at the pump filling a bucket, the same as he had been on her first morning, and he looked up when she came around the corner of the tack barn, and he touched his hat without breaking the rhythm of the pumping, and he said, "Coffee's on the stove." She did not go in for coffee. She walked down into the yard, and she stopped on the other side of the pump, and she said, "Wade." He set the bucket down. He straightened. He waited. She said, "I will stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere else," she said. "I have somewhere else now. Sarah Tilden offered me the back room over the post and dry goods last Tuesday, and the wages to go with it, and my mother has written from Omaha twice, and her sister has softened, and I could be on a train east in 3 days if I chose," she said. "I am telling you that because I want you to know that staying is a thing I am choosing and not a thing I am settling for," she said. "I will stay because I want to," she said. "And because when you say my name, it sounds like a name and not a complication." She stopped. She had not meant to say the last part out loud, and she felt the warmth come up into her face the way it had not come up in years, and she stood there at the pump in the gray light, with her hands twisted into her apron, and she watched Wade Calloway's face do the small, slow thing at the corner of his eyes. And then she watched, with a soft shock, the thing move into the rest of his face until it was an actual smile, the first one she had seen on him in 7 weeks. He said, "Mabel," he said. "That is the best answer a man ever got at a pump in the gray of a morning," he said. "Thank you." He did not move to touch her. He did not move toward her at all. He picked up the bucket, and he carried it to the horse trough, and he tipped it in, and he came back, and he pumped a second bucket, and he said over his shoulder, "You might want to move your things out of the bunk room into the spare room off the kitchen when you've a free hour. On account of the bunk room roof leaks in October, and we are coming up on October before we know it." He said it the way he said the weather, and she heard under the practical surface of it the careful giving of room, the small important fact that a spare room off the kitchen was not the bedroom of a married woman, and was not the bunk room of a hired hand either, that it was a third thing, a room of her own inside the house, and that this third thing was being offered without further question. She said, "I will move them this afternoon," he said, "much obliged." And that, in the dawn of a Tuesday in the 3rd week of July, in a small basin where 2 creeks came together 6 miles south of Buffalo, Wyoming, was how Mabel Rourke chose her life. The trial of Harlan Pace was held in Buffalo on the 14th of August. Mabel went in with Wade in the wagon, and they were met at the courthouse by Bart Henley, who had the cream-colored letter in the inside pocket of his coat and the sworn statements of 3 men in his hand, including the man with the load of buckshot in his backside, who had decided, the sheriff explained dryly, that loyalty to the Pace name had its limits, and that one of those limits was a county prison term. The courtroom was full. Half of Johnson County had come to see what kind of trial a man like Harlan Pace got. The same way half of Johnson County had come in June to see what kind of woman the younger Pace had sent away for, and the same feathered hats and summer suits filled the benches. Mabel sat in the second row, in a new dark blue dress Sarah Tilden had helped her choose, with her hair in its plain knot and her father's pocket watch in her skirt pocket, and she did not look at any of them. She looked at the front of the room. She was called to give testimony in the early afternoon. She walked to the witness chair, the same way she had walked the aisle of the chapel, alone, level, looking forward. She gave her name and her place of residence and her occupation, which she gave as hired hand at the Calloway place, in a clear, plain voice that carried to the back of the room. She answered every question the prosecutor put to her without ornament. She described the first letter that had come to her at the Calloway place on the first Sunday of July. She described the offer of $100 and the train ticket east. She described the second offer of $200 made in person in the yard on the evening of the 9th day after the cutting of the fence. She described when she was asked the words Harlan Pace had spoken to her in the yard, and she repeated them in the same flat voice in which she had spoken them, including the part about her unfortunate proportions, and she did not allow her voice to shake on the words because she had practiced them 3 times in the bunkroom the night before, and she said them now as a thing that had been said to her, and not as a thing that was still true. The courtroom went very quiet on those words. The lawyer for Harlan, Pace, a thin, sharp man down from Cheyenne, rose to cross-examine her, and he tried, in the smooth, careful way of such men, to suggest that she had misheard or misremembered, or had perhaps a motive of her own to color the account, and Mabel let him talk. And when he was done, she said only that the thin young clerk in the buggy had heard every word, and that Eli Carmichael of the next place over had heard every word from the gate, and that Sheriff Bart Henley had heard every word from the second buggy, and that the brindle dog June had heard every word too. And while the dog could not be put on the stand, the other 3 could, and the courtroom did the small uncertain thing a courtroom does when it has begun to laugh and has decided it should not. The lawyer from Cheyenne sat down. Harlan Pace was found guilty on the count of conspiracy to destroy property, on the count of conspiracy to drive livestock, and on the count of attempted bribery to suborn a witness to leave the jurisdiction. He was fined a sum that Mabel did not entirely understand the size of, but that Wade told her later was substantial, and he was bound over for a further proceeding in the federal court at Cheyenne on a separate matter involving the brand on the sorrel gelding, which Wade said with the smallest of dry edges was likely to occupy Mr. Pace's attention for some time. The Pace and Pace Stockman sign came down off the office on Main Street in Buffalo 3 weeks later, and the holdings were sold off in pieces over the following winter. And by spring, the name of Pace was a name people in Crook County said in the past tense. Cyrus Pace, Mabel heard from Sarah Tilden one afternoon at the dry goods, had taken a position in a bank in St. Louis and had married a banker's daughter, and Mabel found that she could hear the news without any feeling in particular attaching itself to it, the way a person hears the weather of a distant country. She wrote her mother in Omaha that night and told her about the trial and about the spare room off the kitchen and about the $8 the month, which had become $10 the month at the start of August, by Wade's quiet insistence. And she did not tell her mother yet about the answer she had given at the pump in the gray light. Because that was a thing she meant to tell in person, in her own time, when her mother came west on the train Wade had paid for in advance without making a ceremony of it. In October, her mother came in October. She came on the 3rd of the month on a Thursday, and Wade drove the wagon into Buffalo to meet the train, and Mabel went with him in the new dark blue dress. And when Eliza Rourke stepped down from the train car with her one small carpet bag and her hat askew from sleeping against the window, she looked at her daughter on the platform, and her daughter looked at her, and they did not speak for a long minute because there was a great deal that had to be said between them, and neither of them quite knew where to start. So they started. Small Eliza said, "You have color in your face." Mabel said, "It is the wind out here. It puts color in everyone." Eliza said, "And you look." She stopped. She tried again. She said, "You look like a woman who has eaten her supper." Mabel understood with a small, soft shock. that her mother had been trying for 26 years to find a way to complement her body, and had finally, on the platform in Buffalo, landed on a sentence that fit, and Mabel began to laugh and Wade Calloway, standing a respectful distance away with the carpet bag already in his hand, to the small thing at the corner of his eyes again that was almost a smile. And that was how Mabel's mother arrived at the Calloway place, laughing on the platform with her grown daughter under a wide October sky. Eliza stayed 3 weeks. She slept in the spare room off the kitchen, and Mabel moved her things temporarily up into the bunkroom because the roof, as it happened, had not leaked yet that fall. And in the 3 weeks Eliza was there, she watched her daughter feed the hens and read the flock and ride out with Thomas to bring the lambs down for the cold. And she watched Wade Calloway in his level, quiet way ask Mabel's opinion on the price of winter hay, and defer to her on the matter of the layers, and pour her coffee at supper without being asked. And on the evening of the 17th day, Eliza came out onto the porch where Mabel was sitting with a shawl around her shoulders, and she sat down in the other chair, and she said, "I have wronged you, child." She said it plain, she said. "I have spent your life apologizing for you, and I have only now understood that I was apologizing to people who did not deserve a word from me about you," she said. "I am sorry." Mabel did not answer at once. She watched the last of the light go pink along the ridge to the west. She said, "Mother," she said, "you sent me on a train to a man who did not want me." Eliza said, "I did," Mabel said. "And that man stood me up in front of a chapel full of strangers, and I walked out of that chapel onto a road that led me here," she said. "I am not going to thank you for sending me, because what you did was not a kindness," she said. "But I am going to tell you that I do not carry it against you any longer, because the road went where it went, and I am where I am, and I am, Mother, where I want to be." Eliza put her hand over her daughter's hand on the arm of the chair, and she did not say anything else. And they sat that way until the last of the pink went out of the ridge, and the first stars came up over the eastern grass. And the brindle dog June came up onto the porch and laid her notched head once across Eliza's foot the way she had laid it across Mabel's knee at the pump in the 2nd week. And Eliza, who had been afraid of dogs her whole life, did not move her foot. Eliza went back to Omaha in the last week of October because her sister was not well and needed her, but she went on the understanding, made plain at the train platform with Wade standing the same respectful distance away, that she would come again in the spring, and that this time she would come for longer. Perhaps consider whether Omaha was the place she meant to die in, or whether a small house in the town of Buffalo, near enough to ride out to the Calloway place of a Sunday, might suit her better. Mabel said the latter would suit them both very well, and Eliza touched her daughter's face with her gloved hand once and got on the train. The first snow came on the 4th of November. It came soft and slow in the night, and Mabel woke to a world gone white and quiet, and she stood at the window of the spare room off the kitchen in her night dress and her shawl, and she watched the snow lying on the rails of the porch, and on the roof of the tack barn, and on the long, low roof of the lambing shed, and she felt, for the first time in her life that she could remember, the particular happiness of looking out a window at weather, and knowing she did not have to go anywhere she did not want to go. They were married on the 11th of November, on a Tuesday, by the same minister at the small Methodist chapel at the crossroads, 4 miles south, with Sarah Tilden as witness, and Thomas as witness, and Eli, who had grown 2 inches since July and whose cowlick had finally, mercifully, begun to lie down. The brindle dog June lay across the threshold of the chapel door the whole of the ceremony, and the minister, who had married a great many people in his time, said afterward over coffee at Sarah Tilden's that he had never in his life performed a quieter or more certain wedding, and that he counted it among the 3 or 4 he would remember to the end of his days. Mabel did not wear the white dress from the carpet bag. She wore the dark blue dress, and she carried in her skirt pocket her father's pocket watch, and when the minister asked her if she would have this man, she said, "I will," in the same clear, plain voice in which she had given testimony in August, and when he asked Wade, the saying of it was, as the narration of his rare words had long noted the weight of a great many other things he did not need to say. By the following August, a year and 2 months after Mabel Rourke had walked out of a chapel in Buffalo in a white dress, with 22 buttons down the back, the Calloway place had 310 head of sheep on the high meadow. A flock of 42 laying hens producing more eggs than the household could eat, which were sold weekly at Sarah Tilden's at a steady small profit, credited to Mabel's own account, a new wing on the lambing shed that Wade and Eli and a hired carpenter from Buffalo had put up in May, and a small one-room frame house going up on the rise above the creeks, where the two of them came together, which was meant for Mabel's mother and would be finished, Wade said, by the time the leaves turned. Thomas was still in the wagon out on the high meadow, 60 some years old, and bent the same as he had been. But he came in now to the home place every 7 days instead of every 10, on account of, he said gruffly to Wade one evening, the coffee being better since the new wife had taken over the pot, which Wade reported to Mabel at supper, with a small smile at the corner of his eyes that was no longer rare. Eli was 16 and worked at the Calloway place 6 days in 7 now, with the 7th kept for his mother. And he had told Mabel solemnly on his birthday in June that he meant to learn every single thing she knew about poultry and to start a flock of his own on his mother's 40 acres in the spring. And Mabel had told him equally solemnly that she would help him pick the foundation hens herself. Sarah Tilden had become almost without anyone noticing the moment of becoming Mabel's closest friend, and the two of them spent one afternoon a week at the post and dry goods drinking coffee and going through the ledger of the egg account, and Sarah had taken to calling Mabel sister in the dry, sideways way of a woman. Bart Henley, the sheriff, stopped by once a month on his rounds and stayed for coffee on the porch, and he had said to Wade on a visit in early July with the cream-colored letter long since filed away in the courthouse archive that of all the cases he had carried in 22 years of wearing the star, the Pace case was the one he was proudest of having seen through, and that he counted Mabel Calloway, as he now called her, among the 3 or 4 citizens of Crook County he would have trusted with his own life. The wedding dress with the 22 buttons stayed in the bottom of the carpet bag, and the carpet bag stayed in the bottom of the cedar chest in the spare room off the kitchen, which was now Mabel's sewing room, and she did not take it out, and she did not throw it out, because she had decided in the bunk room by candlelight that a thing did not need to be looked at to be kept, and that some things were kept precisely so they did not need to be looked at. The letter from Harlan Pace had been returned to her by Bart Henley after the trial was concluded, and she had taken it out of the courthouse with the calm of a person collecting a coat from a cloakroom, and she had folded it one last time along its existing creases, and she had put it in the kitchen stove on a cold morning in February and watched the cream-colored paper darken at the edges and curl inward and go up in a small bright flame. And she had not felt triumph then either, only the same long, slow settling she had felt watching the black buggy with the red wheels go down the wagon road in July. The pocket watch she carried now in the pocket of her work apron during the day and set on the small table beside the bed at night, and she touched it less often than she had because she did not need it as often as she had, and the not needing of it was, she thought, perhaps the truest measure of the year that had passed. She had grown smaller in some ways across that year and larger in others. She did not weigh herself because she did not own a scale and because she had no interest in the answer, but she knew from the taking in of the seams of the dark blue dress in March and again in June that her body had changed under the work of the place, and she knew also that she did not care about the change one way or the other, that it was only a thing her body had decided to do on its own and not a thing she had set out to make happen, and that the not caring was, like the not needing of the watch, a measure of something. She was still a large woman by any honest accounting, still the largest woman in any room she walked into in Buffalo, and she had stopped, in the course of that year, apologizing for the fact, in the small ways she had spent her life. Apologizing for it, She did not duck her head when she came into Sarah Tilden's. She did not pull her shawl forward to obscure her shape when she sat in the chapel at the crossroads. She did not refuse a second helping at supper because of who might be watching, because she had learned in the kitchen of Wade Calloway that there was no one watching except a man who set the second helping on her plate himself, and said only, "Eat. You have worked." There were two more things she had not yet told anyone, and on a still warm evening in the last week of August, she told Wade the first of them. They were sitting on the porch step the way they had sat on the evening after Harlan Pace had been taken to the courthouse in the back of the deputy's wagon, side by side but not touching, with coffee cooling between them and the brindle dog June across both their feet. The light was going pink along the ridge to the west, she said. "Wade," he said. "Mabel," she said, "I am going to have a child in the spring." She said it the way he had taught her to say things level without ornament, the way a person reports the weather of a day they have already lived. He did not move for a long count. She let him have the count. She had learned by now that Wade Calloway needed a count for a thing of any size, and that the count was not a hesitation but a way of letting a thing arrive properly. Then he set his coffee cup down on the porch board beside him, with a great deal of care, as though the cup had become breakable in a way it had not been a minute before, and he turned his face to her, and she saw with a small clean shock that there was water in his eyes. He did not let it fall. He was not a man who let such water fall, but he let her see it, which was a thing he had not done before, and she understood that the seeing of it was a gift he was offering her in return for the telling. He said, "Mabel," he said, when she said the doctor in Buffalo says late April or early May, by his reckoning, he nodded slow, and he looked back out at the ridge, and after a long minute he said, "My boy with the fever was 4. He said, his name was Thomas. He said, I have not said his name out loud in 3 years. He said it the way he had said the thing about his wife on the porch step in July, as a fact set down beside himself. And Mabel did not reach for it. She let it sit between them where he had put it. She said, "Thomas is a good name," he said. "It is?" he said. "It was my father's name too," he said. "I do not know yet what I would want this one called," he said. "That is something we will think on together," she said. "We will." They sat with that a long while in the pink light, and at some point he reached, without looking at her, and he put his hand over hers on the porch board between them. And that was the first time he had taken her hand, in a year and 2 months of marriage, and a year and 7 months of knowing her. And she understood that the not taking of it before had not been an absence of feeling, but a careful holding back of a thing he had not wished to spend cheaply. And she understood further that the spending of it now was the largest thing he had ever given her, and she turned her hand under his, and laced her fingers through his calloused ones, and held on. And the brindle dog, June, sensing in the way dogs sense such things that something had shifted in the air above her, sighed once heavily across both their feet and did not move. The second thing she had not yet told anyone, she told nobody, because it was a thing she had told herself only, in the dark of the spare room that was now her bedroom, on the night she had first known about the child. She had lain in the dark with her hand over the small low place under her ribs that did not yet show anything and would not show anything for weeks more, and she had said out loud to the dark and to no one that she took back the promise she had made on the iron bed in Crook County. She said it plain. She said, "I will trust," she said. "I will hope," she said. "I have already done both, and the doing has not killed me, and I will go on doing both as long as I am given a body to do them with." She said it, and she lay in the dark and listened to the 2 creeks braiding together in the grass beyond the window, and she felt the old promise lift off her chest the way a flat stone lifts off a patch of grass that has been pressed down under it for a long time, and she felt the grass under the stone begin, slowly, to come back up. The child was born on the 29th of April in the spare room off the kitchen that had been the sewing room that had been Mabel's bedroom before. It had been their bedroom in the small hours of the morning, with a midwife from Buffalo and Sarah Tilden in attendance, and Wade Calloway pacing the kitchen with the brindle dog June pacing behind him step for step. It was a girl. She was small and red and furious and entirely whole, and Mabel held her wrapped in a flannel that Eliza had sent from Omaha in February, and she counted the fingers and she counted the toes, and she counted, when she had finished both, the small dark hairs along the crown of the small dark head, and she stopped counting, because there was no number for them, and because she did not need a number any more for anything. Wade came in when the midwife allowed it, and he stood beside the bed, and he looked at the small red furious thing in the flannel for a long count, and at the end of the count he sat down in the chair by the bed, and he put his face down into the edge of the blanket beside Mabel's hip, and his shoulders shook once, twice, 3 times. And he did not make a sound, and Mabel put her free hand on the back of his head and held it there. And they did not say anything for a long time. They named her Eliza Thomas Calloway, after Mabel's mother and after Wade's son, and Mabel's mother, who had come west in March and was now living in the new one-room frame house on the rise above the creeks, walked down the path at dawn when Sarah Tilden came up to fetch her, and she came into the spare room and she sat on the edge of the bed, and she took her granddaughter into her arms, and she said, oh, she said it small. She said it the way a person says a word they have been saving their whole life for the right moment to spend, and Mabel watched her mother's face and saw on it a thing she had not seen on her mother's face in 27 years, which was a face that was not apologizing for anything to anyone. Eliza Thomas Calloway, who was called Ellie before she was a week old, by Eli, who had appointed himself her older cousin on the grounds that he did not have a sister and meant to make do, grew up on the Calloway place in the small basin where 2 creeks came together 6 miles south of Buffalo, Wyoming. And she grew up knowing the names of every hen in her mother's flock by sight, and the way to splint a lamb's leg with 2 willow shoots and a strip of flour sack, and the names of the 4 people her father had loved before her, which were her mother and her grandmother, and Thomas, and the brindle dog, June, who lived to the great age of 14 and died in her sleep on the porch, in the pink light of an October evening with Ellie at 4 years old, asleep against her side. By the time Ellie was 5, the Calloway place ran 420 head of sheep on the high meadow under Tomas, who was 70 and bent further but who refused to come down off the wagon for any reason short of the weather, and 70 laying hens under Mabel, who had become known throughout 3 counties as the woman to write to about a sick flock or a failing coop, and a small dairy of 6 milk cows under Eli, who was 21 and married now to a girl named Anna from the next valley over, and who lived with Anna in a small house Wade had helped him build, and who came to the Calloway place 6 days in 7, the same as he had since he was 14, because he had said, on the day Wade had offered to release him from the standing arrangement, that he did not see any reason to alter a thing that had worked well for 7 years running. Sarah Tilden had married Bart Henley, the sheriff, in the 3rd year after Mabel's wedding, in a quiet ceremony at the chapel at the crossroads, with Mabel as witness and Wade as witness, and the 2 of them had moved into a small house behind the post and dry goods, and Sarah had begun to call Bart husband in the dry sideways way she called Mabel's sister, and Bart had said once on the porch of the Calloway place over coffee that he had not expected, at 55, to be a married man again, and that he counted it among the 3 or 4 best things that had ever come to him, and Wade had said only, that is a list a man does well to keep short. And the 2 of them had drunk their coffee in companionable silence the way men of their kind drank coffee. Eliza the elder, who had been Mabel's mother and was now Ellie's grandmother and was in the small society of the Calloway place and the chapel at the crossroads and the post and dry goods, simply Grandmother Rourke, lived in the one-room frame house on the rise above the creeks for 11 years, and she died there in her sleep on a still, warm evening in June, with the door open to the porch and the meadowlarks going quiet one by one in the grass, and her sewing in her lap, and Mabel found her in the morning when she came up the path with the breakfast tray and stopped in the doorway, and she set the tray down on the porch board very carefully, and she sat down in the other chair beside her mother, and she took her mother's cool hand, and she held it for a long time, and she did not cry, because her mother had had a good death in a place she had chosen, and because crying was not the response the moment called for. She told Wade at noon when he came in from the south pasture, and Wade did the small, slow thing at the corner of his eyes that meant grief in him, and he said only, "She was a good woman, Mabel," he said. "She came around. She said she did." They buried Eliza Rourke on the rise above the creeks, by her own written request, in a small plot Wade had fenced with cedar posts the same winter the one-room house had gone up, and Ellie, who was 11 now and as tall as her mother's shoulder, stood between her parents at the graveside and held both their hands at once. And Mabel felt the small, warm hand of her daughter in her right hand and the calloused hand of her husband in her left. And she felt herself standing on a rise in a small basin in Crook County. Between the two people she had not, on a Tuesday afternoon in late May 17 years before, been able to imagine into existence, with the certainty that lives somewhere under the ribs that her mother had given her this, that the letters she had read at the kitchen table between the sugar tin and the chipped blue pitcher, the letters she had folded along its creases and answered with a small, frightened yes, had been the first stone in a path that her mother had laid down out of fear and out of love in the wrong proportion, and that the path had gone in the end exactly where it had needed to go. She thanked her mother in her head, silently standing at the graveside in the long pink light. She did not say it out loud, because her mother had not, in life, been a woman who knew what to do with thanks. She only said it in the quiet of her own chest, and she said it once, and that was enough. The Calloway place stayed in the Calloway name. Ellie, who at 16 could read a flock as well as her mother and a horse as well as her father, and who had her grandmother's careful slanted hand and her father's level, quiet voice, took over the home books the year she was 18, and by the time she was 22 she had married a Tolden, who was the elder of Sarah and Bart's two boys come home from the railroads, and the two of them lived in the main house with Wade and Mabel for 3 years before building their own house on the rise where Grandmother Rourke's had stood. The small frame house having been left standing in her memory and used now as a sewing room and a place for Mabel to take her coffee on the mornings when she wanted the long view east. Mabel was 43 when her first grandchild was born, a boy named Wade for his grandfather, and called Wade the younger to avoid confusion at the supper table, and she was 45 when her second was born, a girl named for the brindle dog June by Ellie's own decision, on the grounds that a dog who had been a member of the family was as good a person to be named for as any. The county changed across those years, the way counties change, slowly, and then all at once the railroad came nearer. The town of Buffalo grew. A man in a motor car drove down the wagon road past the Calloway place in the summer of Ellie's 20th year, and the brindle dog, June II, who was the great-granddaughter of the original June, chased the motor car for a quarter-mile and came back into the yard pleased with herself. Wade Calloway, who was 61 that summer, watched the motor car go down the road from the porch with his coffee in his hand, and he said only, "Well?" He said it the way he said the weather, and Mabel, sitting beside him in the other chair, knew that a great deal was packed into the well, and she did not ask him to unpack it, because by the 35th year of their marriage she could unpack it herself without his help. He said it again later in a different voice, on the porch, on a still warm evening in October the year he was 68, when he had come in from the south pasture slower than usual and had sat down in his chair with a long, careful breath, and he had taken her hand the way he had taken it on the porch the night she had told him about the child, and he had said, "Mabel," he had said, "I have had a good run of it." He had said, "I want you to know I have had a good run of it, and I want you to know the run started on the day you came up that road in a wedding dress, and I want you to know I have known it every day since." He said it level the way he said everything, and Mabel held his hand, and she did not answer at once, because she had learned in 40 years that he did not need her to answer at once. And she watched the pink go along the ridge to the west, and after a while she said, "The run is not over," he said. "No," he said, "but I wanted you to know," she said. "I know," she said. "I have known since the second cup of coffee at the scrubbed pine table on the second night." He did not have a great deal of time left after that, as it turned out. He had 3 more years, which was more than the doctor had predicted, and less than Mabel had hoped, and he spent them on the porch, and at the pump, and in the horse barn, slower each year, but unchanged in the level, quiet way he moved through the days. And he died on a still warm evening in June in the spare room off the kitchen that had been their bedroom for 43 years, with Mabel holding one of his hands and Ellie holding the other, and Wade the younger and June the younger standing in the doorway, and Tomas, who had outlived his own predictions by 20 years. Sitting in the chair by the window with his hat in his lap, he said before he went the same thing he had said on the porch that October. He said, "Mabel," he said, "I have had a good run of it." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Thank you." She said, "You taught me a name was a name." He smiled, the small, slow thing at the corner of his eyes that had become the whole of his smile. And he closed his eyes, and after a while he was gone, and Mabel sat with his hand in hers a long time, and she did not cry then either, because she had cried already across the months of his slowing down, in small private installments that had not asked anyone to witness them, and because there was no crying left in her for this particular moment, only the long, slow settling she had felt watching the black buggy go down the wagon road in July of a year so far in the past that it was now a story she told her grandchildren in winter by the stove. They buried him on the rise above the creeks, beside Grandmother Rourke, in the small plot fenced with cedar posts, and Mabel stood at the graveside in the pink light, with Ellie holding one of her hands and Sarah Tilden, who was 72 and bent now herself, holding the other. And she said the words the minister at the crossroads asked her to say, and she did not falter on any of them. After the burying, she went back to the house and she put on the kettle, because there were people who had come and people would need coffee, and she moved through the kitchen in the level, quiet way Wade had moved through the yard for 43 years, and Sarah Tilden, watching her from the table, said softly to Ellie that Mabel Calloway was the strong,